So I want to say good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to my IR honors thesis presentation. Let's begin. Take a close look at this picture. What is this highly decorated World War I German general doing in China in 1934? These troops here must be German, or are they Chinese? How did Chiang Kai-shek's son become a decorated Wehrmacht tank commander? Between 1914 and 1945, practically every able-bodied German man wore a uniform. But what happened to them in the interim? The career opportunities for ambitious officers lay elsewhere, and that's why many famous names appear, of all places, in China. For the first half of the last century, the Germans were the management consultants of war. If you had a naval or monetary problem, you called the Brits. But if you wanted to build a modern army from the ground up, you called the Germans. Men like Max Bauer, Hans von Seeckt, and Alexander von Falkenhausen were simply the best in the business. With a mandate from the highest levels of the Chinese and the German governments, their job was to accomplish the unlikely, the creation of the first truly national Chinese army. This is an odd couple for sure, German officers in nationalist China, and culturally this arrangement doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. My thesis argues they may have succeeded in surprising ways. Before I set out to find the answer, I structured my inquiry around these three broad research questions. Why do nations choose to cooperate? When do they choose to conflict? How and why did post-colonial relationships change? Why did China choose Germany as her mentor? And to what extent did the Germans modernize and reform the Chinese army? And why did the relationship end? My first research question was partially what prompted my interest in the area. China cooperated with the USSR for much of the 1950s. When Mom was growing up in Beijing, however, she had to do duck and cover drills under her desk. Not because they were afraid of American ICBMs, because of Soviet ones. By the 1970s, China's 10-year honeymoon with the USSR had become a bitter hatred. I began to wonder why nations cooperate, why they stop cooperating. So I turned to an earlier period in Chinese history to help to understand the forgotten German role in China's modernization. To do research, I secured UAR funding to scour archives in Germany for original documents like these policy memoranda on China. I've also examined the secondary literature in English, German, and Chinese to see whether, in Chinese, scholarly voices are hotly divided on whether the Germans really made any difference at all. Some say the corruption and incompetence of the nationalist Chinese military leadership diluted the German military reforms. Others say the Germans contributed sorely needed expertise and hardware at a crucial time for national consolidation. I lean towards the latter view, and I'll outline my reasons why. That doesn't mean that the literature itself is perfect. The biggest problem I discovered is that there's almost nothing written in English about my area of study. My thesis is determined to change that. I taught myself German so I could understand the German advisors in their own words. Poring over policy memoranda, letters, and photographs in these three archives has given me a rich insight into their world. Still, the current secondary literature does a pretty poor job of telling us who the German advisors really were. Through painstaking primary research, I hope to put faces with names again. For without names, there can be no historical agency. The average German military advisor would have been a middle-aged, field-grade officer who was a decorated veteran of World War I with right-wing political leanings, despite being averse to the Nazis. The officers were well-educated and the finest practitioners of their military art. The motives for being in China were diverse, but they all believed that they were serving the interests of German foreign policy in the Far East. I had to dig through German military archives to find these photos in particular, because their activity in China was officially secret. I crunched the data and discovered some things about the composition of the military mission. The first thing we noticed is a heavy representation of middle and high-ranking officers, including 10 generals. The Germans also bundled a number of civilian advisors and foreign specialists into their advisory mission. And here, I've broken down the German military personnel by their branch specialization. And we can see immediately an overwhelming representation of infantry in the green, which naturally reflects Germany's and China's status as land powers. To consolidate his personal rule, Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek tasked his German advisors with building him a modern China. By the mid-1930s, German capital was funding the infrastructure built by German firms to make Chiang Kai-shek powerful and themselves rich. As part of the strategic partnership, German industrial firms gained access to China's inexhaustible rare earths, like tungsten for armor-piercing shells. The Germans used legal loopholes and shell companies to secretly funnel the latest weaponry to China. Soon, German rifles, machine guns, flak cannons, and even tanks could be seen on Chinese streets. War was big business, and the Germans found China to be one of the best foreign customers in their history. With investments to protect, it soon became in Germany's political interest to build up a strong China as a counterweight to the Soviet Union. But the Sino-German relationship was not simply transactional. Both countries were outcasts in the international system. Both countries felt wronged by foreign powers. The Chinese could rest assured that the Germans had no further colonial designs upon them, unlike the Americans and the British. And I found this unlikely marriage of convenience was, at least for its time, a remarkably equitable one between a European and a non-European power. Slowly but surely, the Germans started molding the Chinese into their own image, and this sense of cooperation extended even further into the philosophical realm. A broad unity of philosophical purpose enabled the Germans to make a disproportionate impact in China. The Germans and the Chinese both heavily emphasized the role of a well-educated officer corps to lead party, army, and nation. Chinese students were invited back to Germany to learn everything from chemistry to governance to engineering. And for many years, nobody could really be sure what the Germans actually thought about their Chinese advisees. But I discovered this 1939 after-action report in the German military archives where the Germans who had been to China recorded their experiences. The Chinese, for their part, were very quick learners. And I find this statement about building a relationship of trust very telling and interesting. The all-out Japanese invasion of China in 1937 forces us back to one of the central questions of my research. Did German military assistance deliver any meaningful impact? In the short term, as I've explored in several case studies, yes. Using weapons and tactics learned from their German advisors, elite Chinese units gave the Japanese a bloody nose at Shanghai and dashed Japanese aspirations for a quick conquest of China. China could not decisively stop Japan in 1937, but by employing classic German tactics such as defense in depth and strategic encirclement, Chinese troops were able to deny the victory that Japan so desperately needed. One question we must ask is, what caused such a fruitful relationship to end so abruptly? After years of protests from Japanese diplomats, the German government ceased trying to broker a peace between China and Japan and recalled all of its advisors home to Germany in July 1938. But I argue that this break in relations was a long time coming. It was not the rise of Nazism per se that caused the Sino-German relationship to collapse. Cooperation was most intense between 1933 and 1937. It was actually supported by a number of prominent officials in the early Third Reich. Rather, I think the end of cooperation was due to a combination of factors. The proximate cause was German bureaucratic politics in spring 1938, in which ideologically committed, pro-Japan Nazis ousted conservative, non-Nazi, and pro-China officials within the German government. But the two long-term causes have been bubbling under the surface for at least since 1934. Nazi racial ideology saw the Japanese as a more suitable partner against international communism, despite the considerable economic and military interests the Germans stood to lose in China. Pro-Nazi officials in the foreign ministry were also convinced that Japan would be a more effective counterweight against the USSR than China beset by foreign issues, or internal issues. To prepare for the future war against Soviet Russia, as the argument went, Germany would be best served by trading up to the strong horse in Asia. China was friendless in the world until Pearl Harbor brought America formally in the war against Japan. But the German advisors do not quite vanish from the pages of history. Many of the Germans who had been to China, most famously von Falkenhausen, were very actively involved in the July 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler. Perhaps their time instructing the Chinese had reminded them of a common humanity that was missing at home. In recent years, historiography on the mainland has shifted to allow a greater discussion of the German role. If you go to the Jianchuan Museum in the western city of Chengdu, you can see this bust that the Chinese government has placed to honor General von Falkenhausen. And I hope that by writing this thesis, I can give men like him the recognition they deserve. In the end, the Germans could not save nationalist China in 1937, but nor could the Americans in 1949. To the extent the Germans tried to recreate a Prussian army in the Far East, They did not succeed within the narrow time frame they were granted. But insofar as they created the first truly national armed forces in Chinese history, they must receive credit. Studying this period holds a number of useful lessons for our own, I think. The first thing we see is that states on the margins of the international system often find creative ways to militarily cooperate with each other. And that's why we see this North Korean RPG in the hands of this Iranian proxy Shiite militiaman in northern Iraq. The second thing we learn is that modernizing backward militaries, such as today's Afghan National Army, is very difficult. For American policymakers, the experience of the Germans in China teaches us to mind the gap between expectations and reality. Creating lasting military change requires deep institutional reform and not just advanced weaponry. Battlefield competence cannot be purchased at any price. I want to close on the human dimension because I think this is something that the excellent literature really lacks. Chiang Kai-shek's son Wei Guo studied at the Munich Military Academy in the late 1930s, where he was well liked and respected by his peers. For the rest of his life, he spoke German with a Tyrolean accent and still wrote letters to his old soldier friends in Germany and Austria. This shows that being Chinese did not disqualify him from his circle of alte Kameraden, old comrades. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Before I get started, I just want to thank everyone in the IR Honors Program. Thank you to Professor Gould for all of your support through the past years and for the year, and the IR Honors Cohort, and a huge thanks to my thesis advisor, Steve Stedman, as well. And thank you to all of you for coming out this morning. So today I'll be presenting on my thesis, Living Up to Responsibilities, UN Humanitarian Interventions, and the Impact of R2P. Within the realm of international affairs, the UN has played an integral role in maintaining international peace and security among sovereign nations since the end of the Second World War. As stated in the UN Charter, the UN has also enshrined norms of respect for state sovereignty and non-intervention within the domestic matters of the state. Increasingly since the end of 1945 to the contemporary era, human security has also become an increasingly important part of global security and has necessitated actions within the human rights sphere in order to ensure peace. However, the UN's Peacekeeping Division has struggled to implement these goals, particularly after the Cold War. Specifically, peacekeeping disasters in the 90s and conflicts such as Bosnia, Rwanda, and Somalia have shown that the UN is unequipped to deal with these new modern conflicts. They are now predominantly intra-state or civil wars rather than interstate. Thus, a debate emerged in the 90s following these peacekeeping disasters over whether the UN should intervene in interstate conflicts such as Rwanda or Srebrenica in order to avoid violations of human rights, or whether they should uphold traditional notions of state sovereignty and non-intervention within the domestic matters of the state, as stated within the UN Charter. So in response to these peacekeeping failures in the debate over sovereignty versus intervention, a new concept was created called Responsibility to Protect, or R2P. R2P was unanimously agreed upon by UN member states in 2005 and created a new framework for humanitarian interventions. Overall, the principles of R2P can be summed up into three main pillars. The first of which is that the primary responsibility to protect civilians from four main cases of mass atrocity, genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, lies within the state itself. And if the state is unable to protect its people, then the international community has a responsibility to utilize peaceful measures such as diplomatic or economic measures in order to help the state protect its people. And then finally, only if these two previous pillars are inadequate, then the Security Council is now authorized to take forceful measures, including military interventions, in order to protect civilians. So overall, R2P revives these traditional notions of state sovereignty and non-interventionism that we see in the UN Charter, and made sovereignty contingent upon protection of civilians, meaning that the UN now had greater authority to intervene in the domestic matters of the state in order to ensure human rights protections, and overall gave the UN more authority to intervene in intrastate conflicts rather than solely interstate conflicts. So overall, for my research, my main question was, what effect did the responsibility to protect doctrine have on the way that the UN performs humanitarian interventions, and has R2P truly succeeded in its mission of preventing and abating mass atrocities? So to answer this question, my thesis first takes a quantitative approach through statistical analysis, and then a qualitative approach through 3 case studies in order to examine these effects in further detail. So a quick roadmap for my presentation. First, I'll be discussing the existing scholarly literature on this topic. Then I'll go into my research design for my statistical analysis, followed by my quantitative findings. Then I'll discuss my research design for my case studies, followed by my qualitative findings. And then I'll conclude with some future challenges to R2P and policy implications. So overall, the current scholarly literature can mainly be divided into 2 separate sections, the qualitative and the quantitative. The qualitative works mainly take a historical and empirical approach to analyzing the normative effect of R2P. However, these works don't really examine how R2P has actually changed how the UN intervenes. And then on the other hand, the quantitative works take a statistical approach to analyze UN peacekeeping more broadly, and they're able to point to specific factors that determine UN intervention. However, none of these works examine R2P specifically, and most of them are even pre-2005. So in order to bridge this gap, I'll be using the qualitative works to develop testable hypotheses that I'll analyze through my quantitative analysis, including the effect of R2P. And then I'll examine this effect more empirically through my 3 case studies. So for my research design for my statistical analysis, my unit of analysis is internal armed conflicts from the end of the Cold War to 2017. My method of analysis is a survival time analysis, which measures time to event. In this case, I'm measuring time until UN intervention in a conflict. And then in terms of my independent variables, below are some of the ones I looked at, but most importantly, looking at the effect of R2P on affecting UN intervention speeds. So given that R2P gave the Security Council greater authority to intervene in civil wars in order to protect civilians, I'm hypothesizing that after R2P, these intrastate peacekeeping missions will be implemented faster because of this enhanced authority. So overall, after a couple different models and regressions, I found that the only time R2P is actually statistically significant in determining when the UN intervenes is only in conflicts with fewer than 1,000 battle deaths. So as you can see through the left-hand red bubble, in these conflicts, R2P actually accelerates intervention by 66%. So overall, I take this to mean that R2P only really has an effect in nascent conflicts, and in these cases, R2P is used as a tool for preventive interventions. So next for my case studies, I really wanted to know more about what is actually driving these interventions that we see empirically. So to answer this question, I used a process tracing method to analyze the presence of 3 different driving variables. The first is an imminent risk of mass atrocities, which brings in the applicability of R2P. Next is pressure from regional organizations, which is necessary to actually push the UN to take action in a conflict. And then finally, there needs to be an interest of the Security Council P5 to actually create an intervention, and this can be defined as at least one member of the P5 has an interest in intervention and none are opposing. So for my case studies, I chose 2 cases in which there was an intervention under R2P, which was Libya and Cote d'Ivoire, and then a third one in which there was applicability of R2P because of the presence of mass atrocities, but no intervention, which was Syria. So first for Libya, in terms of mass atrocities, there was a lot of violence against protesters surrounding the 2011 Arab Spring protests and violence from the Gaddafi regime against civilians. Particularly, Colonel Gaddafi also had direct rhetoric against suggesting violence against civilians and possible mass atrocities. There's also a lot of regional pressure garnered by the League of Arab States, the African Union, and the GCC, which were all pushing for the UN to intervene in Libya. And then finally, in terms of interests of P5, the UK and France had an interest in implementing a no-fly zone in Libya in order to create peace and security in the Mediterranean. The US also reversed its previous non-interventionist stance to support intervention for civilian protection, and Russia and China ended up abstaining from the intervention. So overall, this led to Resolution 1973, which was the first usage of R2P for a humanitarian intervention, and it authorized all necessary measures to protect civilians within Libya. So next, in Cote d'Ivoire, there was a lot of electoral violence surrounding the 2010 presidential elections, and the incumbent president, Gbagbo's forces, had fired against protesters, and there were concerns of possible imminent mass atrocities. And then in terms of regional pressure, the economic community of West African states, along with the African Union, were significantly pushing the UN to intervene further in the conflict. And then for P5, there was an inherent French interest in the country, given that Côte d'Ivoire was a former colony of France and they had significant ties. And there was also a previous peacekeeping mission already in the country, which the P5 had already implemented. So overall, this led to Resolution 1975, which authorized all necessary means to carry out a mandate to protect civilians and also reaffirm the responsibility of Côte d'Ivoire to protect its people. So finally, in the case of Syria, there have been clear cases of mass atrocities surrounding the 2011 Arab Spring protests and the Assad regime's use of force against protesters and civilians. There's also been evidence of chemical weapons use against civilians perpetrated by the Assad regime. However, in terms of regional pressure, regional organizations have largely been silent on the issue. Particularly the Arab League has even moved to readmit Syria into the Arab League. And then in terms of interest of P5, there's been a lot of buyer's remorse from the Security Council regarding the interventions in Libya and Côte d'Ivoire and criticism surrounding possible overextensions of their mandate. And then in terms of Russian and Chinese interests in Syria, both the Russians and the Chinese have an interest in maintaining the status quo in Syria and keeping the Assad regime in power. So overall, the interventions in Libya and Côte d'Ivoire reveal some future challenges to R2P. Mainly, there have been a lot of criticisms of these interventions due to their ambiguous mandates and trying to figure out how to implement a civilian protection mandate within an intervention. And there's also been the new question of civilian protection versus regime change, and how far these interventions can actually go in intervening in the domestic matters of the state to actually protect civilians. And then finally, in terms of policy implications, the quantitative portion of my thesis has shown that R2P has been used as a tool for preventive interventions for the UN. So in order to better prevent these mass atrocities from even emerging in the first place, there should be a shift in focus from Pillar 3 action under R2P, which deals with the use of force, and a shift more towards Pillars 1 and 2, which deal with diplomatic and peaceful measures in order to prevent these mass atrocities from even emerging in the first place. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Kanani Schnider, and today I'll be presenting my thesis, Erasing the Rohingya, the Historical Roots of Myanmar's Genocide. I'd like to thank Professor Erica Gould, my advisor David Cohen, and the rest of the IR Honors Cohort. Located in the heart of Southeast Asia, Myanmar is a Buddhist country that recently has transitioned from an authoritarian regime to a nominal democracy. Though the vast majority of people in Burma are ethnically Burman, Myanmar is home to numerous ethnic minorities as well. However, in August of 2017, the military government began an ethnic campaign in the northernmost Rakhine state, home to the Rohingya people, a stateless Muslim minority. The government accuses the Rohingya of being illegal Bengali immigrants. By December of 2017, the military's Scorched Earth campaign had driven 650,000 Rohingya to flee to refugee camps in Bangladesh. Anti-Rohingya sentiment disseminates to the Burmese populace through multiple ways, one of them being extreme propaganda, such as this hateful cartoon, which circulated widely after the genocidal attacks in 2017 and mocked the Rohingya's plight. Here, we see the Rohingya, symbolized by crocodiles, crossing the river to Bangladesh after killing Buddhists, symbolized by the innocent animals in the background. Once in Bangladesh, the crocodiles are depicted as complaining to a Western reporter, "I had to flee the motherland." Such mockery begs the question, why and how did this genocide begin? Hence, my research questions. In my thesis, I firstly look at how the Rohingya's historical narrative is situated specifically in the context of Burmese state building. Secondly, I look at the historical and the religious seeds of Myanmar's genocide, particularly why the Rohingya, of all ethnic minorities in Myanmar, were targeted for genocide. These questions aim to address gaps in the literature, which as of yet rarely present the Rohingya in the context of nation building, and has yet to focus on the Rohingya in contrast to the relationship with other minorities. For my methods, I took a qualitative human rights approach to primary and secondary sources to come up with my analysis, and I begin by examining the theory that exists behind the construction of national identity and then apply such theory to the case of Myanmar. In my thesis, I identified two factors, that of religion and that of shared history, that I believe have the greatest influence upon Burmese national identity. The same factors that the state is using to cast the Rohingya as illegal Bengali immigrants. To answer my second question of why the Rohingya, I conducted a case study analysis of two other minority groups, Burmese Muslims and the Karen people, to highlight components of Rohingya identity that have left them most vulnerable to the state. This matters because so far there has been such little coverage, relatively, on the genocide and the Rohingya people in general, due to decades of systematic erasure by the state through legislation and daily grievances. For today, after touching briefly on national identity, I'd like to shift the majority of the focus to my case study analysis on Burmese Muslims and the Karen, and then leading into my thesis and broader conclusions. So what does it mean to be Burmese? Well, in the history of Burmese state building, it would be impossible to talk about Myanmar without talking about the colonial legacy of the British. The British colonized Myanmar in 1886 and used their divide and rule policy to exacerbate existing tensions that existed within the country on ethnic cleavages, and also humiliated Buddhist monks, which held a sanctified role in Burmese society, by showing preferential treatment to ethnic minorities. After Burma gained independence in 1948 and the British withdrew from Burma because of World War II pressures, the resentment that had been built for decades by the majority towards the minorities came to the fore. The effect of the British cannot be overstated in terms of explaining what's happening today in Myanmar. However, it would be overly reductive to say that this is the sole factor in causing the outbreak of violence in 2017. This is specifically what the state wants people to think, as it decreases the amount of accountability that the state must hold. While the Burmese kingdom had oppressed people of Rakhine State far before British arrival, the depiction is painted now that such divides existed only after the British arrived, but this is not true. Buddhism has always played a large role in Burmese society, which is a highly politicized religious state. So is there space in this formation of nation building in Myanmar for a Rohingya minority, a stateless, Muslim, much darker skinned group? The Rohingya people speak a dialect of Bengali and have been stateless since the 1982 Citizenship Act, which robbed them of their citizenship and hence their freedom of movement. Linguistic evidence, census data, and documentation of Islam in the Rakhine State since the 9th century AD disproves fully the state's claims that the Rohingya are illegal Bengali immigrants. While ethnic minorities like the Rohingya in Myanmar abound, the division of when one minority becomes another is highly contested. Most popularly, the Burmese populace concurs that there are 7 main ethnic groups. However, recently the authoritarian regime has published a list of 135 ethnic groups. Despite this large jump, one thing remains constant, and that's in both the 7 list and the 135 list, the Rohingya are consistently omitted. Nevertheless, despite this confusion, ethnic minorities in Burma abound, and national boundaries drawn in post-colonial states are arguably arbitrary and often cruelly so. Myanmar is no exception to this. As you'll see from the map, the minorities in Myanmar exist dominantly in the border states on the fringe of the country. My case studies focus on the Rohingya, located in the northernmost part of Rakhine State to the west, on the Karen people, located in the easternmost state of Cayenne on the border of Thailand, and then on Burmese Muslims as a group at large, centrally dispersed throughout the Irrawaddy Delta region of the middle of the country. So why these case studies? Well, analyzing key identity factors that situate the Rohingya, Burmese Muslims, and the Karen people from each other allows me to better understand why the Rohingya were targeted in particular. To do so, I'm looking at which factors have the greatest predictive power in increasing Rohingya's vulnerability. While Burmese Muslims share religion with the Rohingya, they have the advantage of not being geographically condensed in one area of the country. However, the Karen people are geographically condensed in one area of the country, but their race and religion, they trace their roots to the East Asian Mon Kingdom, and their religion is primarily Buddhist, have less in conflict with the majority of the state. Despite these differences, one thing remains, and that's that all three minorities were highly favored by the British, which means that today, all three minorities are targets of the state's resentment. I've compiled this table of the factors of identity that I believe are most salient in explaining why the Rohingya in 2017 were targeted. Beginning with language. Burmese Muslims speak predominantly Burmese, and the Karen people speak a family of languages that are rooted in the Tibetan-Burman branch of linguistics. As I mentioned, their geography, located in the east, the Karen people are also Buddhist, animist, and around 30% are Christian. What this means is that while the religion of the Rohingya people automatically makes them stand out, their geography and their language also allow the state to create an evidentiary basis for a faulty claim that they're illegal immigrants. This claim doesn't work so well with the Karen people, whose language roots show that they've been in that region for centuries, as well as the fact that their ancestry has been traced consistently so to the Mon Kingdom, which would have been in that region in the first place. Looking specifically at the ancestry of Burmese Muslims, like those in Rakhine State, the state argues that a lot of them came in during colonial times to be workers and thus were elevated to a different economic status, higher than that of the majority. While this is true, many of those Muslims also have traced their roots to being in Burma far before the British arrival in 1886. What this means, essentially, is that the Burmese state has used the seemingly evidentiary basis of geography and language to show that the Rohingya are illegal immigrants, whereas in reality, those statements are based more in the state's Islamophobia and the state's fear of the darker-skinned minority group. A vast amount of literature shows that such fears are substantiated in the psychology of otherness. So this has tremendous implications for the legislation that serves to marginalize the Rohingya people. The Rohingya people, unlike Burmese Muslims and the Karen, are stateless. While Burmese Muslims, some of them have lost their citizenship as well, the majority have been relegated to carrying ID cards but are permitted to be in the country, whereas the Karen has legislative recognition not only in their citizenship, but also in documents such as the Panglong Agreement of 1947 on the eve of independence, which granted three minorities protection under the law. The Rohingya, of course, were absent from such protections, and not only are they absent from such protections, but are growing increasingly absent from documentation of ever existing in Myanmar in the first place. In 2014, the Rohingya were completely eliminated from the census, while the Burmese Muslims and the Karen were not. Circling back to this idea of why then were the Rohingya targeted, I argue in my thesis that language and geography have much more of a role than the current literature is stating. I think that in the thesis, the role of the British cannot be overstated. We must also be very cognizant to take these other factors into account because it's too reductive to point to only one. This is why in my thesis I'm looking at the Rohingya in the context of state building, pointing to their religion and their shared historical narrative, and then discussing why the Rohingya were targeted, again focusing on language and geography. The conclusions to be drawn from this are that my thesis has much broader implications, not just for the human rights atrocities committed against the Rohingya, but also for what nation building looks like in post-colonial states in general. Because the coverage on the Rohingya is so little, it is very important that we pay attention. Thank you.
It's the year 1991. Anita Hill is being questioned by a room full of congressmen about her recent accusation of sexual harassment against Supreme Court Justice nominee Clarence Thomas. On a 52-48 vote, the Senate confirms Clarence Thomas as the Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. In the outrage that follows, 1992 becomes known as the Year of the Woman. 48 women are elected to the House, and 6 are already sitting in the Senate. Since this watershed moment in 1992, women's advancement into Congress has continued at a slow yet unremitting pace. Today, women compose 23.4% of the Congress, and most Congresswomen have not been appointed to powerful positions within parties or committees. In existing literature on women in Congress, there's a gap. There's little to no exploration of how female senators affect legislative outcomes, and more importantly, why women are needed in politics. This puzzle leads me to ask, between 1992 and 2015, how did the increase in women's representation in Congress affect legislative outcomes? In this thesis, I make the case for Congresswomen, arguing that gender parity in Congress is the key to improved legislative outcomes. Today's presentation is composed of 4 sections. First, I'll explore the existing theory about how women affect legislative outcomes. Next, I'll use regressions and case studies to make the case for Congresswomen. The regressions offer a quantitative exploration of how women impact Congress, and the qualitative case studies offer an in-depth analysis of 2 congressional transitions, from female to male and vice versa. Finally, I'll share the broad conclusions from my thesis. Let's begin with theory. In the literature, there are 4 main hypotheses about how Congresswomen affect legislative outcomes. First, the productivity hypothesis posits that Congresswomen are more productive than their male counterparts in terms of the number of bills sponsored, especially given the institutionalized barriers they face in making sure that an introduced sponsorship becomes a law. In support of this, one author utilizes a legislative effectiveness score to evaluate the trajectory of a bill and finds that being a female lawmaker translates into approximately a 10% increase in legislative effectiveness. Even further, women in both the majority and the minority party are found to introduce more bills than their male counterparts. The second hypothesis is that a diverse Congress leads to diverse legislative outcomes. State-level data from 12 states found that women prioritize legislation concerning women, children, and family issues more than men. And conversely, male legislators place priority on business and economic legislation. In this thesis, I refer to this difference in priority areas as women's issue bills. The third hypothesis is that Congresswomen have distinct leadership styles in terms of greater collaboration and attention to the common good. Surveys of congresspersons in 1995 and 2002 reveal that Congresswomen report spending more time building within party and across party coalitions than men. And additionally, laboratory experiments repeatedly show that female subjects tend to be more likely to desire universalistic outcomes and group cooperation, whereas male subjects tend to prefer competitive solutions. These differing leadership styles often inform the more liberal ideologies of Congresswomen, as female legislators are more liberal in terms of social welfare, consumer safety, and environmental regulations. They're also more opposed to the use of force both domestically and abroad. The final hypothesis is that Congresswomen more effectively represent diverse constituencies. Women report spending more time keeping in touch with constituents, and this civic-mindedness influences their emphasis on community representation. Furthermore, they more effectively represent underrepresented minority groups, for example, through their perspectives on social welfare, women's health, and public goods. With these 4 hypotheses in mind, we'll move on to the crux of today's presentation, the regressions. The data set used covers all of the senators between the 103rd and 114th Congresses, and it tests the first 2 hypotheses about productivity and diverse legislative outcomes. The model correlates gender in a senator with 3 dependent variables: productivity, diverse legislative outcomes, and effort allocation. So the independent variable here, the most important thing that we're looking at, is the gender. And we're thinking about how that gender in the senator affects the 3 dependent variables. Those dependent variables are productivity, diverse legislative outcomes, and effort allocation. Productivity. Do female senators sponsor more bills? I selected bill sponsorship as an indicator of legislative productivity because it most clearly reflects a legislator's policy preferences before considering Congress's voting preferences. Diverse legislative outcomes. Do female senators produce more women's issue bills than their male counterparts? That is, education, social welfare, civil rights, liberties, and minority issues, families, and housing and community development. I chose these issue areas because various authors posit that female legislators produce more of these kinds of bills. The final dependent variable is effort allocation. Do female senators devote more of their overall bill sponsorship to women's issues? There are 3 control variables here: political party, majority party in Congress, and senators' tenure. These controls are designed to remedy any biases that affect the relationship between gender and the dependent variables. And while such controls can't completely confirm causation, they can mitigate the effects of extraneous factors. Moving on to our findings. The productivity model considers gender and total number of bills sponsored. As you can see, congressmen sponsor 0.1 more bills than their female counterparts. But the results here are not statistically significant. The takeaway here is that there is insufficient evidence to either confirm or disconfirm the productivity hypothesis, and further investigation would be needed on this front. The diverse legislative outcomes regression considers whether congresswomen are more likely to sponsor women's issued bills. And when including controls for gender, party, majority, and tenure, as well as Congress and state fixed effects, the coefficient is 0.7. This means that for every 1.7 women's issued bills sponsored by a man, his female colleague sponsors 2.4 of such bills. Thus, we can conclude that the inclusion of congresswomen diversifies the overall bill sponsorship. Third, and finally, the effort allocation regression also affirms the diverse legislative outcomes hypothesis. This model asks whether women are more likely to devote a larger share of their overall bill sponsorship to women's issued bills. The answer here is yes. Women devote 1.5% more of their overall bill sponsorship to these women's issued bills. Based on the model, there is sufficient evidence to confirm the diverse legislative outcomes hypothesis. At this point, at the very least, this thesis has illustrated the need for women in Congress because they bring diversity to the types of bills that are being sponsored. The diversity often better incorporates the policy needs of underrepresented minority groups such as women, the socioeconomically disadvantaged, and communities of color. For the sake of time today, I won't delve into the second piece of the empirics, the case studies, but it is important to note that they do confirm the 4 hypotheses. Case 1 is the male to female transition from Frank Murkowski to Lisa Murkowski in Alaska in 2002. Case 2 is the female to male transition from Carol Moseley Brown to Peter Fitzgerald in Illinois in 1998. The key takeaway from these 4 cases is that they do offer support for the hypotheses of productivity, diverse legislative outcomes, distinct leadership styles, and representational focus. Finally, we'll conclude today with the broader conclusions from my thesis. If there's anything for you to take away from today's presentation, it's that between 1992 and 2015, the increase in women's representation in the United States Congress immensely affected legislative outcomes for the better. In terms of productivity, while the regression does not confirm this hypothesis, the case examples indicate that female legislators indeed do sponsor more bills per session. Lisa Murkowski sponsored 46 bills on average per session, compared to Frank Murkowski's 41 bills. Similarly, Carol Moseley Brown sponsored 20 bills per session, compared to Peter Fitzgerald's 16 bills. While these are individual cases, the differences do reflect a greater priority on bill sponsorship by the female senators being studied. In terms of diverse legislative outcomes, as mentioned in the regression, women sponsored 0.7 more women's issue bills and devote 1.5% more of their bill sponsorship to such issue areas, as also proven by the cases. And finally, the cases similarly confirm the collaborative leadership styles and representational focus of female senators. Time has passed and progress toward gender equality has been made. But in some ways, things are very much the same. The need for gender equality in Congress is clear. Not just to match the 50-50 composition of the American electorate, but moreover, because there are clear benefits from gender parity in Congress. In recognizing these truths, this thesis seeks to make the case for congresswomen. To conclude, I'd like to share my gratitude to the people without whom this undertaking would not have been possible. To the IR cohort, thank you for your constant commiseration and celebration. To Professor Gold, thank you for encouraging us to reach our greatest potential. And finally, to my advisor, Professor Gary Cox of the Political Science Department, thank you for answering my infinite questions, teaching me more than I could have imagined, and supporting me with relentless patience and encouragement. To everyone, thank you for listening, and during the next election cycle, vote for women.
Okay, good morning everyone. My name is Renata Miller, and today I'm presenting on my thesis titled Closing the Floodgates, the Origins of U.S. Immigration Policy Towards Latin America and the 1965 Hart-Celler Act. My advisor throughout this year has been Professor Zephyr Frank, who I owe many thanks to. So here's a brief roadmap of my presentation today. I'll be starting with the introduction, which includes relevance to today, the scholarly literature on the subject, and my research question. Then I will overview my methodology, followed by an empirical deep dive into my analysis of the House of Representatives. I will then finish with some closing thoughts. Here are some recent headlines that I'm sure you are all familiar with. The debate over immigration, in particular immigration from Latin America, has been front and center in the United States. These articles highlight some of the largest controversies, such as the debate over family reunification or chain migration, and the Central American migrant caravan late last year. Many of these articles discuss a bill in particular, the 1965 Hart-Celler Act. Amidst this immigration debate, journalists and scholars are looking back to this bill because it is the foundation of our immigration system today. Many of our current immigration policies, such as family reunification, can be traced back to this act. So the 1965 Hart-Celler Act was a revolutionary bill because it abolished the racist national origins quota system, which had been in place before. It opened up the country to immigrants from Africa and Asia for the first time, and eliminated the focus on admitting only white immigrants. But what did this bill say about immigration from Latin America? This is an important question to ask, given that immigration from south of the border is of great concern today. The 1965 Hart-Celler Act placed a cap on immigration from the Western Hemisphere for the first time. Prior to then, there had been no numerical upper limit for Latin American immigrants. The scholarly literature on this issue does not address this policy effectively. Most of the literature on the Hart-Celler Act focuses on the bill as a liberal force, a civil rights era bill that eliminated determining citizenship based on skin color. The handful of scholars that do discuss the Western Hemisphere Amendment cap or more in depth are listed here. However, they each conclude that it is not possible to know why the cap was added because it was a compromise made behind closed doors. My thesis addresses this gap in the literature by using statistical analysis to determine what influenced the vote in Congress. That brings me here to my research question: why did Congress add a cap on the Western Hemisphere in the 1965 Hart-Celler Act? This question is especially important today because scholars have credited this policy to the rise of illegal immigration. American historian Mine Gay stated in her work, Impossible Subject, that the inclusion of the Western Hemisphere cap invariably reproduced at even higher levels illegal immigration and made it the central problem that has preoccupied American immigration policy throughout the late 20th and into the 21st century. In other words, she views the provision in question as one of the root causes of our crisis today because it restricted the number of allotted legal immigrants from Latin America. In order to address immigration reform today, it is essential to know or brought about our current policies. In my thesis, I argue that Congress added this cap on Latin America in 1965, mostly because of economic concerns. Those that voted in favor of this cap feared that an influx of immigrants from Latin America would overwhelm government programs. I answer this question by doing separate analyses of the House of Representatives and of the Senate. The House voted on the provision on August 25th of 1965, while the Senate added the provision in closed-door sessions during the month of August 1965. For each chamber, I conduct both a statistical analysis, an approach that has not been used by scholars to answer this puzzle. I then qualify my statistical findings by citing quotes from the House and Senate floor debates. Today I'll be briefly presenting just my empirical findings for the House of Representatives vote. A possible question you might ask is why even focus on the House of Representatives if the amendment was successfully added in the Senate? Even though the amendment failed in the House, it is still useful to analyze it in order to identify the coalitions on each side of the vote. In addition, analyzing the House is beneficial because smaller district sizes provide us with more specific regional U.S. interests. For my statistical regression, my dependent variable in Congress is Congress members' yay or nay vote on placing a cap on Western Hemisphere immigration. In order to choose my independent variables, I had to consider what affected Congress members to vote one way or the other. The following slides will delineate my independent variables and also provide visualizations of House districts in 1965. I created these maps by downloading a shapefile of the 1965 congressional districts and then matching it to district-level data, which I digged up from the 1965 U.S. Census. The most obvious variable to start with is party affiliation of Congress members. On this map, Republican districts are labeled red, while Democratic districts are labeled blue from the 1965 House. Nevertheless, party is a muddled indicator because at this time, the American party system was undergoing a shift. On social issues, many Southern Democrats voted liberally on economic issues, but conservative on social issues. For example, Senator Sam Ervin, a Democrat representing North Carolina and who was also a leader in this bill in the Senate, voted in favor of many Great Society government programs, but was also a vocal proponent of preserving Jim Crow laws. For this reason, I used pool nominate scores of Congress members as my next independent variables. Pool nominate scores break down ideology into two scores, one economic and one social, each on the liberal-conservative continuum. The two maps on the right showed the ideological breakdown of 1965 Congress members. Using nominate scores as variables provides a more precise measure of Congress members' beliefs on the role of government in the economy and on social issues. My next variable is the percentage of Mexican immigrants in each Congress member's district in 1965. I include this variable because Congress members with a larger percentage of Mexican immigrants in their district had an incentive to vote against the Western Hemisphere cap because their district's economies depended on that labor. I also include the percentage of farmers per district for a similar reason. Mexican immigrants were mostly employed in agriculture, and so in theory, Congress members with stronger agricultural interests should have voted against the cap. Finally, this brings me to my results from my regression model with the previously mentioned variables. The three statistically significant variables are the percentage of Mexican immigrants, economic ideology, and social ideology. My hypothesis for the effect of Mexican immigrants per district was correct. Congress members with more Mexican immigrants per district were more likely to vote against the cap. My more interesting finding is the one with ideology. Although most of the current literature on the Hart-Celler Act focuses on the social debate in Congress, here it is clear that this vote was more about economic ideology, given that the coefficient is much larger. What exactly does this mean? This table shows the economic and social positions for the Hart-Celler bill. Economic conservatives were strongly opposed to an influx of Latin American immigrants because they believed that this would overwhelm government support programs. Meanwhile, social conservatives were in favor of the cap because they wanted to limit the number of non-white immigrants. My statistical results show that economic concerns were a strong force behind the vote. My next section will then provide quotes from the House floor debate that actually show these economic concerns. On April 25th, the day of the vote in the House, Representative Chelf, Republican of Kentucky, said on the House floor, "It is coming. We're going to have to adopt this amendment at some point because within the next 35 years, there will be 600 million people down south of the border. Merciful heavens, where are we going to put them all? We simply cannot literally push our own family out of our own home in order to take in our neighbors who live on the same block. I repeat, I love our Latin American friends and all who reside in the Western Hemisphere, but I love America first, last, and always." Many Congress members were similarly predicting a population explosion in Latin America and saying that the United States had to place a cap on those immigrants. The argument was that the United States would not be able to accommodate such a vast number of immigrants. During the same debate, Representative O'Neill, a Democrat from Georgia, stated, "You must also consider that this new influx of immigrants from underdeveloped nations will compound our domestic problems. They will compete with the very class of American citizens our federal government is seeking to aid through its war on poverty. The president either fails or refuses to understand that America is not hurting for population, job seekers, or illiterates." The next step of this economic argument was that this influx of Latin American immigrants would overwhelm American government programs. For economic conservatives who despise big government, they feared that unskilled Latin American immigrants would arrive and become dependent on welfare programs. Many other Congress members who voted to place the cap also expressed similar fears to those of Representative O'Neill. I I've shown that the economic debate was more important to the imposition of the Western Hemisphere cap than previously thought. But why is this important? First off, this finding adds to the current literature on the Hart-Celler Act. It addresses a question that multiple scholars have asked, yet have not found an answer to. In addition, it is important to understand this policy because it is credited for the rise in illegal immigration. In 1965, whole groups of immigrants from Mexico and Latin America, whose entrance to the U.S. would have been considered legal before 1965, suddenly became illegal. This was the first major clampdown on immigration from south of the border. What I've personally found most interesting during my research is how much our debate over Latin American immigration today echoes the debate of 1965. Those earlier quotes could have easily been said in 2019. It shows that we have been having the same debate for many years. In order to solve our immigration crisis today and move forward, we must understand where our current policies came from. Thank you.
Good morning, thank you for coming. My name is Hanukkah Pasi, and I'm presenting my thesis today, The Decision to Prosecute Accountability for Human Rights Violations in Chile and Argentina After Military Regimes. I want to say thank you, as others have, to the IR cohort, to Professor Gold, and especially my advisor, Professor Francis Fukuyama. So these are images of protests from Chile and Argentina in the late 1980s against military regimes that carried out human rights abuses against civilians. In the bottom photo, the group seen is the Madres del Plaza de Mayo, who protested in Buenos Aires asking for answers as to where their disappeared loved ones went. Nora Cortinas, a member of this group, explained her experience as such. Now, we are not the mothers of just one child, we are the mothers of all that disappeared. Our biological children became 30,000 children. And for them, we gave birth to a full political and public life. These niños desaparecidos, or disappeared children, were part of at least 5,000 Chileans and nearly 30,000 Argentines who disappeared, with thousands of others who were exiled, tortured, and murdered by the military regimes. After transitioning to democracy, these countries became cornerstones in the movement for international human rights prosecutions. And understanding how, in the modern world, past regimes would be responsible for crimes committed during their regimes. Argentina and Chile were faced with a difficult task of how to heal from mass atrocities while still maintaining some unity and faith in government institutions. So the question of reconciliation faced by Argentina and Chile are not limited to those two countries. Calls for justice in all forms are heard around the world today. Tunisia, Sri Lanka, Venezuela, to name a few, are countries struggling with how to handle human rights abuses by past regimes. Many of these transitional states are looking to historical examples to understand the role prosecutions can play in national healing. So because of their role in establishing precedent for global human rights prosecutions and accountability, Chile and Argentina serve as strong case studies. Looking at the causal mechanisms for prosecutions in the two countries can provide insight into who are the important actors in pushing for prosecutions, what circumstances make prosecutions feasible, and what types of prosecutions are more effective for retributive justice and reconciliation. These countries can offer lessons for how to heal after national trauma and how we can encourage this reconciliation today. So to contribute to the study of how and why certain methods of accountability are used, I asked two questions. The first is, how did the quantity and choice of judicial mechanisms for human rights prosecutions in Chile and Argentina differ? And the second question is, what was the role of political legitimacy in the decision to prosecute human rights abuses? So as a roadmap for the presentation, I will start briefly by explaining existing arguments for prosecution trends, then I'll talk about my research design, but I'll focus the bulk of my presentation on my findings and a discussion of these results. So to start with the existing arguments, there are three main groups of literature about human rights prosecutions and democratic transitions. The first is power. So with this literature, it focuses on actors that are important in democratic transitions and the desires of those actors. It suggests that the negotiating power of the actors involved is a prominent determinant in the qualities of the democracy that is to come. Second, you have a normative argument for human rights prosecutions, and this is a moral argument that prosecutions for human rights should occur because they're the right thing to do and they're necessary for national healing. And finally, there's a comparative argument which focuses on the influence of countries with similar experiences, cultural backgrounds, or geographic proximity on how countries understand prosecution trends. the diffusion effect of prosecution mechanisms is central in this literature. So in the literature that exists, this generally focuses on democratic stability and how it is preserved in countries, but it doesn't really focus on how human rights prosecutions as accountability mechanisms are related to that process. These prosecutions were used as bargaining points amongst actors during the transition, and so my thesis seeks to provide insight into how the cases of Chile and Argentina use democratic stability and human rights prosecutions as intertwined mechanisms that reflect each other. So moving into my research design, I have two main parts. So the first part of it focuses on prosecution details. So in this section, I collected information about human rights trials in Chile and Argentina related to the military dictatorship. And the goal of this was to provide a comparison of not only the quantity and time span of these prosecutions, but also details like domestic versus international trials, the crimes people were accused of, verdicts, appeals, and the ranking of the accused. The second part of this thesis is where I build a story about the main actors who influenced the prosecution trends in both countries immediately following the transition to democracy. Through speeches, newspaper articles, and congressional records, I explain the role of political legitimacy, democratic preservation, and negotiating power in accountability and transitional justice. So I'm going to very briefly discuss the causal mechanism section, but I'm going to focus on the prosecution details, although I'm happy to go into more detail about the causal mechanism in the Q&A portion. So moving into my findings, to start off, I wanted to take a big picture look at the trends in the two countries. So this graph shows the number of prosecutions, the GDP growth rate, and the political parties each year. So noteworthy within Argentina is that the prosecutions were concentrated immediately after the transition to democracy. And also that there's been a large amount of political turnover. So I show the different parties in the colored bar underneath the years. Notable in 2001, there were 3 different executives in power at that time, so there's been a lot of transition in this country. Looking at Chile, it's clear that Chile's prosecutions occurred many years after the transition to democracy. The shades of blue for political parties all represent parties that were part of the Concertación coalition, which is the coalition that took power after the transition to democracy. So it indicates that there was a long period of political consistency in Chile after Pinochet. So examining these broader trends gives a good sense of place and time for the context of these prosecutions, but it doesn't give detail about how these two countries' mechanisms for prosecutions actually differed. So for that, I'll show some notable trends in the two countries' prosecutions. So to start off, looking at the rank of those who were prosecuted in the military regimes shows whether the person on trial was of high, middle, or low ranking within the military and the administration in power. So the trends between these two countries, as you can see, were nearly the same, indicating that both chose to pursue the high-level officials at the highest rates. So the second slide shows the number of counts. So number of counts is the number of crimes for which the person on trial was being held accountable for. There are large amounts of unknown data here, as you can see, especially with Argentina. So in the sources that I used, there was some ambiguity, and I tried to fill in the gaps from these reports from human rights organizations, but there's still a lot missing. Part of the reason that they may be missing is because large counts may have varied during the trials based on new information being brought forward. Also, there's a mixture of domestic and international trials, and so there's different recording mechanisms. But I wanted to mention this still for the data that is here, because you can see in Argentina there was a focus on accusing people who were tried for greater counts, so over 100 counts per person being accused. And that suggests that the courts were holding high-ranking officials accountable for a wide breadth of crimes in Argentina, while in Chile the focus was on specific crimes that were documented and not broad-spanning violations of human rights. As you can see, the majority are concentrated in less than 10 counts. So looking at the verdict, this is the most disparate trend between the two countries, with all but one trial resulting in guilty verdicts in Argentina and a lot more variance in Chile. The significance of this difference in trends could be the result of specific selection of cases to pursue. So in other words, Argentine courts could have been selective in the cases they chose to try for the purpose of projecting an image of accountability. By trying members of the junta against whom they had the most substantive evidence, the new Argentine democracy could visibly demonstrate its difference from the military junta and provide accountability for citizens. It could also be indicative of greater documentation of the crimes by the military regimes in Argentina when compared to Chile. So finally, I want to look at the crimes that people were accused of in these trials. And it's noteworthy that the majority of charges in Chile were for homicide and murder, abduction, kidnapping, and disappearances. In Argentina, the crimes that were prosecuted were evenly distributed amongst charges. So, aligning with the trends with verdicts, the number of these trials related to crimes against humanity and international human rights violations in Argentina suggests that there might have been more judicial freedom to prosecute for those crimes. So the focus on homicide, murder, and kidnapping in Chile suggests the accusation of crimes against humanity or human rights abuses was more contentious, and thus the prosecutors were more hesitant to try. So to summarize the important takeaways from this, both countries targeted high-ranking officials, implying that they were the ones most responsible for human rights abuses. Chile focused on its prosecutions on individual crimes that were committed, while Argentina tried leaders for widespread violations of human rights, with the counts being of over 100. There was a difference in verdict trends, which suggests that there was a different process for selecting who to try and how much evidence was necessary in those trials. And finally, the types of crimes being tried for were different, with Chile's being focused on crimes like abduction and homicide instead of crimes against humanity. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a second part of my thesis focusing on a causal mechanism. As I mentioned, it's just going to very briefly mention this, but both countries had similar actors who influenced the decision to prosecute and the methods with which prosecutions were carried out. These actors were the most influential groups in defining how these prosecutions happened. And in Argentina, the executive found it politically and electorally opportune to advocate for prosecutions as soon as the transition to democracy occurred. While in Chile, the existing military had legitimacy and negotiating power, so they were able to protect themselves from initial prosecution. When financial scandal and international pressure for accountability increased, though, the democratic government started to prosecute, as it was no longer a threat to legitimacy and stability. So just to summarize my answers here for this question about political legitimacy, as I said, Argentina is prosecuted most heavily immediately after the transition due to institutional support and political opportunity. While in Chile, they sought democratic stability through compromise, leading to amnesty for the military regime until political opportunity for prosecution arose. But to just finish this out, I want to come back to the countries that are, and the people that are seeking accountability today, and what the implications of this are for them. So in order to understand how a country undergoing political transition can uphold faith in its new institutions and reconcile with past abuses, we need to look at the powerful actors in the country, the executives, the military, the citizens, and the interest groups. Understanding the bargaining choices that have been made and will be made will allow us to contextualize and perhaps even advocate for human rights and human rights prosecutions. The lesson from Chile and Argentina still ring true today and continue to provide us with framework for understanding the intersection of democracy, legitimacy, and human rights. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Audrey Nguyen, and today I will be presenting my honors thesis research, The History of Sexual Violence in the Vietnam War and Opportunities for Justice. Before I begin, I want to provide a quick content warning. This presentation contains very graphic depictions of sexual violence and war. Please feel free to step out at any time and take care of yourself as needed. In 1969, Life magazine published a series of graphic images of the My Lai massacre captured by U.S. Army photographer Ronald Taberley during the Vietnam War. The images instantly catapulted the My Lai massacre and other mass atrocities committed by U.S. veterans to the forefront of national and international attention. Here is one of the most poignant images to arise from the collection. On the right side of the photograph, we see a young woman curiously buttoning her black blouse. Why would she be fixing her shirt while others are huddled in terror, moments before being killed by American troops? This question sparked the interest of U.S. Army criminal investigators, who later revealed that this young woman, who became known as the Black Blouse Girl, had just been sexually assaulted. Further investigation into the My Lai massacre proved that U.S. soldiers' assault of the Black Blouse Girl was far from an aberration, and that mass rape had occurred at My Lai. However, to this day, no representations of the Black Blouse Girl in museums, in public spaces, in publications, or films include any mention of her assault. The silence surrounding this woman's experience is emblematic of the greater systematic erasure of sexual violence from American public memory and narratives of the Vietnam War. Despite extensive primary evidence of sexual violence perpetrated by the US military against Vietnamese civilians, little to no literature exists on the subject. In fact, in my thorough review of the secondary literature, I identified only 2 scholarly texts that explore the issue of sexual violence in the Vietnam War at all. The broad exclusion of crimes of sexual violence from academic and public memory not only inhibits the development of an accurate and rigorous historical narrative, but also delegitimizes the experiences of Vietnamese survivors and of US veterans. In an effort to address this significant gap in our understanding of the Vietnam War, my research will explore the following questions. What is the history of sexual violence perpetrated by the US military against Vietnamese civilians during the Vietnam War? And what legal and political mechanisms existed to bring justice to these victims? And second, what historical models of transitional justice are best suited to address crimes of wartime sexual violence? And how might these models be applied in the context of Vietnam? Today, I will focus only on the first part of this first question. What is the history of sexual violence in the Vietnam War? I'll begin with a description of my research methodology. I'll then share my empirical findings regarding patterns of sexual violence in the war. And I'll conclude with a discussion of the ongoing relevance and significance of my research in Vietnamese and American society today. In order to construct a comprehensive historical narrative of sexual violence in the Vietnam War, I conducted qualitative textual analysis of hundreds of primary and secondary sources containing testimony from US military personnel and Vietnamese civilians. These sources included US military records, court transcript, US soldiers' memoirs, as well as Vietnamese survivors' memoirs and oral histories. To analyze one of my largest bodies of historical evidence, the Vietnam War Crimes Working Group case files, I traveled to the National Archives in Maryland last summer to view 246 case files documenting over 300 allegations of war crimes by US forces and including over 400 Vietnamese victims of sexual violence. To my knowledge, these records had never been explored in relation to crimes of sexual violence. In addition, I conducted qualitative interviews with former Private First Class John Petwick, who served in Vietnam from 1967 to 1968, as well as Professor Fred Turner, who interviewed dozens of US veterans about collective trauma. I also conducted qualitative interviews with Vietnamese advocates, activists, academics, and diplomats in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City in January 2019. I then conducted thematic content analysis of all of these documents and audio transcripts to identify key patterns and trends in sexual violence perpetrated by the US military. The corroborative quality across these various accounts of sexual violence proved that sexual violence was a systematic and daily occurrence of the war that received official acquiescence. Before I present my findings, it is important to note that these sources should not be viewed as a representative sample of all US veterans or all Vietnamese civilians' experiences during the war. It is also possible that some accounts have been altered, sensationalized, or even minimized. I'd be happy to answer any questions regarding these limitations after the presentation. I've organized my findings into 4 key themes that emerged from my analysis. The evidence I will share now is drawn directly from the testimonies of US soldiers and Vietnamese survivors found throughout my sources. The first theme that emerged from my content analysis was the dehumanization of Vietnamese women, which I believe directly contributed to the sexual violence committed by American GIs. From the beginning of military training, commanding officers instilled the belief among draftees to Vietnam that Vietnamese women were, quote, dinks, villains, creatures akin to communists, and sexual objects to be dominated and possessed. US veteran Jim Roseberry said that in basic training, Vietnamese women were considered pieces of meat. American GIs said they don't even think of Vietnamese women as human beings. They're dukes. According to Professor Heather Marie Sturr, when combined with racism, the devaluation of Vietnamese women by the US military led to mass rape and murder. My sources also illustrate rape as a standard operating procedure, an unofficial policy of the US military. By unofficial policy, I mean that commanding officers not only passively condone this sexual violence, but in some cases actively promoted and even participated in it. According to an unidentified panelist in the Marine Corps, the following instructions took place during infantry training regiment in a class that taught soldiers how to properly examine villagers in order to find valuable intelligence. Quote, when US soldiers went through the villages and searched people, the women would have all their clothes taken off, and the US soldiers would use their penises to probe them to make sure they didn't have anything hidden anywhere. This was raping, but it was done as searching. Multiple veterans confirmed such training. In the 9th Infantry Division, instructions from a platoon sergeant in the 9th Infantry Division said, if there's a woman in a hooch, lift up her dress, and tell by her sex. If it's a male, kill him, and if it's a female, rape her. Ed Murphy provided a particularly damning depiction of rape as military policy, in which he explained that his platoon leader was, quote, condoning everything that was going on because it was a part of policy. He would condone rapes because who was he in a mass military policy? My sources also corroborated the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. Based on secondary literature, we know that the practice of gang rape, mass rape, and rape used as a tool of interrogation is symptomatic of the use of rape as a weapon of war, as distinct from rape as an incidental phenomenon of war. These methods are often employed to punish and humiliate the enemy and to instill terror and shame among the civilian population. All three practices were extraordinarily prevalent in the sexual violence that took place in Vietnam. In regards to gang rape, 75% of cases of sexual violence in the Winter Soldier investigation were gang rape cases, and 50% of cases of sexual violence in the Vietnam War Crimes Working Group files were also gang rape. Without including the graphic descriptions of these instances, I will note that such a disproportionately high rate of gang rape is often correlated with the use of rape as a weapon of war. Next, in the cases in the Vietnam War Crimes Working Group case files, they describe incidences of mass rape in which the US military would raid rural Vietnamese villages and rape hundreds of women at a time. Here are a few testimonies from the oral histories of Vietnamese civilians. I'll read one. The American soldiers killed every family they found in the shelters. They rounded up the women, they cut off their hair and cut off their ears, and they raped them. Finally, across my sources, many anecdotes were shared by female prisoners of war regarding the use of torture in interrogation. David Bang writes, rape was an ever-present coercive force in field interrogations. The procedure in the units was to isolate a woman from the rest of her family and her village. She would be tied up, threatened, and raped regardless of what she told her captors. Altogether, these phenomena illustrate the extent to which rape was employed as a weapon of war by the US military in Vietnam. Finally, across my sources, evidence emerged of deliberate impunity in the US military's response to sexual violence. This included significant peer pressure placed on US military personnel not to report these crimes, as well as the widespread failure of commanding officers to respond to, investigate, and punish these crimes, despite extensive knowledge of what was going on. Richard Brummett wrote that random murder, rape, and pillage upon the Vietnamese civilians was done with the full knowledge, consent, and participation of our commanding officers. John Ketwig added, you couldn't say anything. If you said anything, your own buddies would turn against you. This impunity continued at the institutional level. 25% of cases in the Vietnam War Crimes Working Group case files related to sexual violence, and again, these are considered the most atrocious crimes to have occurred in the war, were never even open for criminal investigation. 80% of the cases never underwent any form of adjudication, and nearly all charges that were made were dropped entirely or to significantly lesser crimes. In this way, the culture of impunity manifested in the weak or non-existent investigative and juridical processes initiated by the US military in response to these crimes. Although rigorous statistical evidence of sexual violence in the Vietnam War has never been collected, the corroborative quality of the accounts of sexual violence documented in military investigations, government records, soldiers' memoirs, as well as Vietnamese survivors and oral histories is incredibly powerful. Across identities and experiences, many US soldiers and Vietnamese civilians describe a rampant culture of sexual violence throughout the war, in which Vietnamese women were dehumanized, sexual violence was accepted as unofficial military policy, and systematic rape was employed as a weapon of war. Such behavior was met with silence, suppression, and widespread impunity. In the latter half of my thesis, I began to explore potential mechanisms of transitional justice that might work to address these crimes. Overall, my research offers only a brief glimpse into the long and painful history of sexual violence perpetrated by the US military in Vietnam. As a result of the severe lack of documentation and reporting of these crimes, many gaps in this historical narrative may never be fully addressed. Nevertheless, I believe continued efforts to uncover more of this history and draw public attention to these crimes is necessary both to interrogate issues of militarized masculinity and to encourage U.S. accountability for the war crimes we commit. Finally, and most importantly, I hope my research serves to acknowledge, validate, and memorialize the experiences of Vietnamese survivors like the Black Blouse Girl, whose voices have been unjustly silenced and whose legacies live on in Vietnamese and American society today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elena, and today I'll be presenting to you the culmination of my research project over the past year. Once again, to reiterate, I'd like to thank the IR Honors Cohort for all of your support, Professor Erica Gold as well, and most importantly, my thesis advisor, Professor Kanani. Today I'm going to be talking about the relationship between mass killings and transnational terrorism. But first, I'd like to give you a brief story. In the 1960s, the 1980s, and the 1990s, the Indonesian government targeted its Achenese Muslim peoples, killing around 400,000. The terrorist group, the Free Aceh movement, emerges from these Achenese peoples and claims to represent them, calling for a separate Achenese state within Indonesia. From 1977 to 2005, the Free Aceh movement has committed over 100 terrorist attacks, several of these being transnational attacks, resulting in headlines such as this one. The broader question that my thesis addresses regards whether or not this phenomenon is generalizable. More specifically, I will be asking the question, do terrorist groups that emerge from or claim to represent the victims of a mass killing commit more or fewer transnational acts of terrorism than other terrorist groups? During my presentation for today, I will be talking about my more specific questions, going into my hypotheses, delineating my research design, and introducing my quantitative and qualitative empirics, as well as some final concluding remarks. My more specific 3 questions for my thesis project are as follows. Do terrorist groups that emerge from or represent victims of mass killings commit more or fewer transnational acts of terrorism than other terrorist groups? Do these terrorist groups commit more or fewer transnational acts of terrorism after the mass killing than they did before the mass killing? And finally, do countries produce more or fewer transnational acts of terrorism after they have experienced a mass killing? In order to answer these questions, it is first imperative to identify a few key terms. These key terms are mass killing, terrorism, and transnational terrorism. All of these definitions are widely used and widely regarded throughout the political science literature. Now onto some theoretical frameworks. In the political science literature on transnational terrorism, there are many factors such as these that are regarded as producers or causal mechanisms for transnational terrorism. Because mass killings are inherently violent, produce refugee camps, result from ethnic tensions, perpetuate political disenfranchisement, create a sense of urgency, and a desire for revenge, it is understandable to make the assumption that mass killings might also be a factor of transnational terrorism on their own. With this research, I will fill the gap in the political science literature that does not currently address mass killings as a factor of transnational terrorism with my quantitative and my qualitative analysis. According to Kidd and Walter, there are 4 main end goals that terrorists have and that influence their distribution of attacks. These end goals are regime change, territorial change, policy change, or social control. Depending on these specific end goals, terrorists will try to influence a specific audience through their different types of transnational attacks. The 3 types of audiences identified by Kidd and Walter are sympathizers who are partial to the terrorist group's cause, antagonists who terrorists attempt to coerce or intimidate, and neutrals who terrorists attempt to gain the attention of. Mass killings lead to transnational terrorism because these victim groups are trying to attain international aid or attention to stop, punish, or overthrow the regime that is perpetrating them.
From these theoretical frameworks, I developed three original hypotheses. The first being that terrorist groups that emerge from or claim to represent victims of mass killings commit more transnational acts of terrorism than other terrorist groups. The second being that these terrorist groups commit more transnational acts of terrorism after the mass killing than they did before the mass killing. And the third being that countries that experience mass killings will produce more transnational acts of terrorism after this mass killing. To test these hypotheses, I first identified the victim groups of the 121 mass killings identified by Ohlfelder and Valentino from 1945 to 2006. Next, I determined the affiliated terrorist groups with these mass killing victims and merged this data set with the Global Terrorism Database data from 2016, as well as Rickman and Rickman's data on transnational terrorism. The final data set looks something like this, organized by terrorist attacks and containing the following information. In order to compare terrorist groups that have been victims of mass killings to other terrorist groups, it was first necessary for my study to define what these different types of terrorist groups might be. The first being mass killing victims, or MKV groups, the terrorist group type of interest. The second being mass killing country victims, or MKC groups, which are terrorist groups that were active in a country during a mass killing, but were not victims of that mass killing. Finally, all other terrorist groups were categorized in the other category. To test hypothesis 1, I first calculated the percentage of transnational attacks per terrorist group. This data was then aggregated at the terrorist group type level in order to calculate the average percentage of transnational attacks per group type. The resulting information shows that the average percentage of transnational attacks per MKV groups is around 14%. This increases to 21% for MKC groups and increases to 32% for other groups. Because terrorist groups that have been victims of mass killings do not commit more transnational acts of terrorism than other terrorist groups, the results are inconsistent with hypothesis 1. To test hypothesis 2, I calculated the average difference in the annual rate of transnational attacks committed by terrorist groups that have been victims of mass killings before the mass killing and after the mass killing. As can be seen by this red vertical line representing this average, terrorist groups that have been victims of mass killings commit around one less transnational act of terrorism per year after the mass killing than they did before the mass killing. Because of this result, that shows that terrorist groups that have been victims of mass killings commit fewer transnational acts of terrorism after the mass killing, the results are inconsistent with hypothesis 2. To test hypothesis 3, I aggregated the terrorist attacks at the country level. Then, as shown by the graph on the left-hand side, the average number of annual attacks per country per year were calculated for before the mass killing and after the mass killing. This difference was then calculated as well. On average, countries that experience mass killings produce 3 more transnational acts of terrorism after the mass killing than they did before the mass killing. These results, because countries that have experienced mass killings produce more transnational terrorism, are consistent with hypothesis 3. But why is this the case? Why do terrorist groups that have been victims of mass killings not commit more transnational acts of terrorism than other terrorist groups and commit less transnational acts of terrorism after the mass killing than they did before the mass killing, despite the fact that countries that have experienced mass killings produce more transnational acts of terrorism after the mass killing than they did before the mass killing? The first possible explanation for this lies in the test for hypothesis 2. Out of the 263 terrorist groups that have been victims of mass killings, only 14 of them existed before the mass killing occurred. This means that the majority of these terrorist groups formed during or after the mass killing was targeting them. Because the previous 2 tests focus on the distribution of attacks of terrorist groups that have been victims of mass killings, they are not able to quantify how mass killings affect the creation of new terrorist groups who then perpetuate more transnational terrorism. The second possible explanation for these dichotomous results lie in the test for hypothesis 1. Because this study assumes that victims of mass killings will commit transnational acts of terrorism via MKV groups and not via other or MKC groups, The transnational acts of terrorism committed by victims of mass killings who join pre-existing MKC or other groups are not counted as being results of the mass killing. This may overemphasize the discrepancy between terrorist groups that have been victims of mass killings and other terrorist groups. For the qualitative study of my thesis, I conducted a historical case study on the relationship between the Bosnian genocide and Al-Qaeda, finding that Al-Qaeda during and after the Bosnian genocide had not only set up fundraising operations, training bases, research centers, and passport distribution operations within the region, but that this had also had a notable effect on the victims of mass killings of the Bosnian genocide. Perhaps this qualitative analysis explains why there was a spike in the number of transnational attacks produced by this country after the mass killing had occurred. And perhaps it also explains why at least 2 of the 19 9/11 suicide hijackers fought in Bosnia in 1995. In conclusion, my study proves that mass killings breed transnational terrorism, not via terrorist groups that have been victims of mass killings, but perhaps via pre-existing transnational terrorist groups that recruit victims of mass killings. Because of this, I suggest that future research focuses on the recruitment mechanisms of pre-existing terrorist groups in regards to victims of mass killings, as well as their membership. In regards to counterterrorism efforts, mass killings should no longer be disregarded as a possible producer of transnational terrorism. If the international community agrees to implement the responsibility to protect principle, the lives of millions of persecuted peoples around the world, and the possible innocent victims of their future terrorist attacks could be prevented. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed hearing a bit more about my research over the past year.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. My name's Lloyd, and this morning I'm going to talk about my honors thesis, Ethno-Religious Diversity and Recovery After Conflict in Post-ISIL Iraq, a Geospatial Approach. This is the country of Iraq, and from 2014 to 2017, the entire green shaded area of this country was taken over by the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, an extremist Sunni Islamic terrorist organization. This conflict displaced 3.2 million people. Iraq estimates it's going to need $88 billion to rebuild. But we know that quick recovery is essential, both because it allows people to put their lives back together, and because the academic literature tells us that post-conflict countries need to recover quickly in order to avoid renewed conflict and prolonged poverty. The international community clearly recognizes this urgency. They've spent $6.4 billion since 2014 trying to stabilize Iraq. But despite this obvious need and the immense effort, here's the puzzle. So here's Sinjar and Tel Afar, 2 settlements that were occupied by the Islamic State in the summer of 2014. They're both located in the northwest corner of Iraq. In fact, they're just a 45-minute drive away from each other. In many ways, these settlements are similar to each other. But they had wildly different post-conflict experiences. 1 year after Tel Afar was liberated, people were returning home, the markets were bustling, and things were on the up now. But 45 minutes down the road in Sinjar, almost 3 years after that town was liberated, reconstruction hadn't even started. So this story should get you thinking, well, why might 2 places that are in some ways very similar recover so differently after conflict? This small puzzle led me to my bigger puzzle: why do some places rebuild faster than others after conflict? There are, of course, a number of different explanations for this, but in my thesis I focus on one core hypothesis, that higher levels of ethnic and religious diversity cause places to rebuild slower. I think that there might be the greatest trust loss between residents in diverse areas, and that more divisive post-conflict control situations arise in them. I think that this low trust and high competition might slow recovery. My thesis has a number of parts, but today I'm going to focus primarily on my causal strategy and empirical results. At points in this presentation, I'm going to hand wave or suggest to you other parts of my presentation thesis, but I'm not going to go into them in depth. With that said, there are 3 major things that I want to accomplish today. First, I want to talk about how I built my key independent and dependent variable. Second, I want to talk to you about my causal strategy and empirical results. I used two different causal strategies. First, I used a regression approach to try and understand the overall landscape of influences on recovery. Second, I used a synthetic control to try and look at the role of ethnic and religious diversity specifically. So I'll show you those strategies and their results in turn, and then finally I'll talk very briefly about why I think these things are happening. So starting with the variable of construction, the key independent variable in my study is ethnic and religious diversity. We needed a way to measure this, and so I obtained settlement-level survey data on ethnic and religious composition of 350 Iraqi settlements that were occupied by the Islamic State from the International Organization on Migration. I used this to build a measure of ethnic and religious diversity. So this is a map of the ISIL-occupied portion of Iraq. The dots in the foreground represent all of the villages in my sample, and I've colored them according to diversity. So my measure is coding the darker places as more diverse. The key dependent variable in this study is recovery, but deciding what recovery after conflict means and how to measure it is kind of a tricky question. One of the common approaches in the literature, and the one that I decided to use, is measure what fraction of pre-conflict GDP is recovered by a certain fixed time period after conflict, and I choose 1 year of that. But now we have a problem, because nobody is measuring the GDP of tiny Iraqi hamlets in the middle of a conflict zone at a monthly basis. So how do we measure post-conflict recovery at the settlement level? My idea is to use satellite-observed nighttime light emissions as a proxy for economic activity. The theory here is that economic processes often emit light at night. Think about cars driving on streets, think about running household appliances, think about the operation of factories or markets like the one you see on the left here in Tel Aviv. All of these things are economic processes, they all emit light at night. It turns out there's an emerging economics literature that compares luminosity data to gross domestic product where we know GDP, and the correlation between these two measures is usually between 70 and 90%. So changes in nighttime light are also clearly visible in Iraqi cities during Islamic State occupation. This graphic is showing you the nighttime lights of Mosul. You can see that they go up during the 3 years that the Islamic State occupied Mosul. Afterwards, they recover. So I obtained about 7 years worth of monthly satellite data, and I used it to plot the destruction and recovery trends of all of my 350 settlements in nighttime light. Here are the two villages from the beginning of the story, Tel Afar and Sinjar. And you can see that although they have very similar pre-conflict and conflict trends, in the post-conflict period, it looks like Tel Afar takes off and Sinjar stays dark for a long time. It turns out that there is huge variation in post-conflict recovery across many settlements. Now, the question is to try and figure out whether ethnic and religious diversity can help us explain this. This plot shows you the simple bivariate relationship between increasing diversity on the x-axis and more recovery on the y-axis. It's clear that there's a negative relationship between these things. More diverse places are associated with slower recovery. But diverse places are different from homogeneous places systematically in a whole bunch of ways other than the fact that they are diverse. So far, we can't say anything about whether diversity is causing slower recovery. For that, we need causal strategies. So I mentioned there were two causal approaches I used in this thesis, and the first was a regression approach, where I tried to understand the overall picture of what influences recovery, if diversity matters at all, and if it does, how big this effect size is compared to the effects of other influences on recovery. So I used a spatial autoregression model. It's a special type of regression model that controls for spatial influences. My key dependent variable is the log fraction of pre-invasion light that is recovered by December 2018. My key independent variable is the ethnic and religious diversity score. But I also added 4 groups of controls. So these are other things that we think might influence recovery that I try and hold constant so that I can evaluate the effect of diversity on recovery specifically. So first, I controlled for some logistical factors that influence the ease of reconstruction. Second, I controlled for some aspects of the experience of conflict. Third, I held constant some pre-invasion population and demographic characteristics, including, crucially, the majority ethnic and religious group in each settlement. Finally, we know that the speed of recovery in one village might have spillover benefits to nearby villages. So that's why I chose this spatial autoregression model, and it does some work to try and hold this local spillover effect constant. So I ran the regression, and then I did some work to figure out what proportion of the total variation in recovery can be explained by the different predictors in my model. This is the result of that test. So you can see that the model can directly assign responsibility for about 40% of the total variation in post-conflict recovery. But I didn't have time to investigate all of these different variables. So instead, I decided to focus on just ethnic and religious diversity specifically. And you can see that this variable explains about 9% of the total variation in post-conflict reconstruction. It's negative and significant in the model. So the rest of my thesis is about this slice of the pie. I wanted to investigate this effect further, to understand how big it is and understand whether it varies over time. To do this, I used a second causal strategy called a generalized synthetic control. So this is the idea of Yuking Zhu at the University of California, San Diego. And the idea here is that for each diverse settlement in my sample, we estimate how it would have performed in the post-conflict period if it was instead homogeneous, but otherwise identical. The core intuition here is that we are using the post-conflict performance of homogeneous settlements that performed similarly to the diverse settlement before invasion to predict how that diverse place would have done after conflict if it was instead homogeneous. Here's the result of that test. So the x-axis here shows you the months relative to liberation. The vertical bar is liberation day, and the y-axis is the light level. The black line here is how diverse settlements actually did on average after liberation. And the blue dotted line is where this model estimates they would have performed if they were instead homogeneous but otherwise identical. We can learn three things from this test. First, it suggests that diversity is perhaps causing places to rebuild slower. There's almost no difference between diverse settlements and their synthetic homogeneous controls before liberation, but after liberation, there's a big one. Second, it looks like the size of this penalty increases over time. And third, we can tell you how big it is. So we can tell you, unlogging these estimates, that after the first year of liberation, high diversity looks like it could be responsible for about a 42% decline in economic activity in diverse places. By 16 months, this is 56% slowdown, and by the end of the second year, if you took a diverse place and you made it homogeneous but left everything else the same, this model suggests that the level of economic activity in that village would double. So I'm going to conclude by giving you the very brief summary of the two things that I think drive this effect, but I'm not going to go into detail on them in great depth. First, I think there's the greatest trust lost amongst Iraqis living in diverse areas. Some people sympathized with ISIL while their neighbors were killed. It's hardest to work together to rebuild with these other people when the people you're supposed to be working with are your neighbors who you used to trust and then betrayed you. I was able to test this using survey data on reported trust. It turns out that the median settlement in the post-conflict period that reports that there's some form of trust problems amongst their village is on average half a standard deviation more diverse on my measure than places that don't report this. Second, I think there's something to do with the strategic choices of local elites here. Today in Iraq, there are many different militas and groups contesting control of different areas. When we look at the places where control is contested between multiple groups, it's overwhelmingly in places that are diverse. I don't think this is a coincidence. To keep it short, I think that there are characteristics of diverse places that make them attractive. So in conclusion, this thesis has suggested some evidence that ethnic and religious diversity might cause places to rebuild slower after conflict. It has implications for practitioners. For example, the US has recently decided to target specifically at groups like the Yazidis and Christians, which overwhelmingly live in diverse areas. If this aid isn't sensitized, that diversity could be a problem. And second, I think it has implications for academics broadly. I'm very thankful to many people for this thesis, but most of all, Professor Fearon, a fantastic thesis advisor, Professor Gould, and the IR Honors Cohort for everything they've done. And broadly, I hope that this work and other work like it can help us understand how to turn the lights back on in places that need